August 1944. A liberated village near Chartres, France. Dust settles over shattered roof tiles and abandoned military trenches as a column of American armored vehicles idles on the narrow cobblestone main street. An old man stands by the curb, holding a tightly folded bundle of faded blue, white, and red cloth against his chest. He steps directly toward the path of the heavy convoy, waving a weathered hand to signal the lead vehicle. The Allied soldiers watch him with tired eyes, expecting a routine request for food, medical supplies, or directions. Instead, the elderly citizen gestures toward the bare wooden flagpole atop the battered stone village hall, whispering a request that halts the entire military column in its tracks. A high-ranking commander is about to prove that a symbol preserved in the dark carries more weight than any weapon on the battlefield. This is the story of what happened when a 74-year-old French mayor asked General George Patton to help him hang a national flag that had been hidden from the enemy for 4 years. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the human being inside the uniform. Mayor François Leblanc was 74 years old. He had spent his entire life in the quiet commune near Chartres, serving as its civic leader through years of peace and the sudden, shattering arrival of foreign troops. He was a man who remembered the old borders, the old sacrifices, and the dignity of a small office. When the occupation began, he chose a quiet, stubborn path of resistance that required no weapons, only a steady hand and absolute silence. His hair was entirely white, his hands trembled slightly from age, and his coat was worn thin at the elbows from years of rationing. Yet, his posture remained unyielding. He carried a heavy secret in his basement, checking it by the dim light of a single tallow candle every single week for 48 months. He did not fight with a rifle, but he kept the soul of his town alive behind a loose foundation stone, waiting for the day when he could hand it to someone strong enough to raise it back into the daylight. General George S. Patton, Jr. was 58 years old, hailing from San Gabriel, California, and commanding the United States Third Army. He had seen the raw brutality of the North African desert and the muddy, blood-soaked tracks of Sicily. He carried the heavy burden of command, knowing that every miles-long advance on the map cost the lives of young men who would never see their homes again. His face was etched with deep lines of exhaustion, his eyes were cold and sharp, and his uniform was covered in the fine, gray dust of the French countryside. He was a leader who demanded absolute perfection, absolute speed, and absolute loyalty to the cause of total victory. He had no time for sentimentality or diplomatic delays as his armor tore through the enemy lines. But beneath the polished helmet and the ivory-handled revolvers, he understood the exact weight of a soldier's duty and the deep significance of a promise kept under the threat of a firing squad. By August 1944, the map of Western Europe was changing with every tick of the clock. The Allied breakout from the Normandy pocket had shattered the German defensive line, sending the remnants of the occupying army into a frantic, chaotic retreat eastward toward the Seine. Tank columns of the United States Third Army were moving at a pace that defied standard military doctrine, bypassing major strongpoints and slicing through the French countryside to cut off the enemy escape routes. In the wake of this rapid advance, dozens of small towns and villages were liberated in a single afternoon, caught in the transitional vacuum between total fascist control and the sudden arrival of American mechanized troops. The retreating forces often left behind a trail of burning vehicles, discarded equipment, and a population stunned by the speed of their deliverance. In many of these newly liberated sectors, local administrations were left in complete disarray. 4 years of systemic oppression, fear, and collaboration had fractured the traditional civic structures of regional France. Military governors and frontline combat commanders routinely ignored local political disputes, viewing the civilian populations merely as traffic obstacles or administrative burdens to be handled by rear-area detachments later. Many officers simply let the local symbols of national identity slide, focusing entirely on fuel supplies, ammunition counts, and the distance to the next objective on their maps. The deeper wounds of the occupation, The quiet indignities suffered by ordinary citizens who had managed to survive under the heel of an iron regime were often overlooked in the rush to maintain the momentum of the Great Offensive. But in this particular sector, near Chartres, the relentless forward drive of the armored vanguard was about to pause for a matter of deep personal significance. An American military interpreter named Captain Arthur Vance, 36, from Boston, Massachusetts, assigned to the 3rd Army headquarters, stepped out of the idling scout car to address the elderly citizen blockading the path of the advancing column. He approached with a professional, cautious demeanor, his hand resting loosely near his holstered sidearm as he took in the sight of the frail Frenchman holding the bundle of cloth. He spoke in polite, measured French, asking the old man to step back onto the sidewalk so the heavy tanks could maintain their tight operational schedule through the sector. The village leader looked into the eyes of the young American officer and shook his head slowly, but with absolute determination. He unfolded the top layer of the worn canvas wrap, just enough to reveal a sliver of the deep indigo wool beneath it. He explained that he had no intention of disrupting the military operation or causing a hazard for the incoming forces. He stated quite clearly that he had waited 48 months for this exact morning, and he simply required the assistance of a young, able-bodied soldier to fulfill a promise he had made to his neighbors. On the day his commune was overrun, the interpreter listened closely, his expression softening as the full meaning of the elderly citizen's request became clear. He realized that this was not a standard administrative complaint or a routine plea for emergency rations. The old man was explaining how he had removed the municipal standard from the public hall under the very noses of the occupying garrison, risking his life to preserve the honor of his community. Captain Vance looked up at the towering, bare wooden mast atop the village hall, and then down at the fragile, trembling hands of the 74-year-old local official. He knew the strict orders regarding civilian interactions and the relentless pressure from higher command to keep the roads completely clear for the westward push. He explained to the elderly citizen that the tactical situation was highly volatile and that the frontline units could not afford to halt their advance for domestic ceremonies. He suggested that the local population handle the matter themselves. Once the area was fully secured by the rearguard elements, the old man stepped closer to the vehicle, his voice rising slightly above the rumble of the nearby engines as he refused to yield. He stated that he had protected the national emblem in the freezing darkness of his cellar floor, while enemy patrols searched his property twice, and he would not see it raised by anyone less than the liberating force. The interpreter looked back toward the command vehicle, realizing the situation had surpassed his authority, and sent an urgent radio transmission up the line. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's command vehicle pulled alongside the stone curb without warning. 4 silver stars gleamed on his clean helmet, and the signature ivory grips of his revolvers rested precisely at his waist. The surrounding soldiers instantly snapped to attention, their boots striking the pavement as a heavy silence fell over the small square. The general stepped down from the vehicle, his movements deliberate, and walked directly toward the center of the road where the elderly citizen stood waiting. He did not speak loudly, but his voice cut sharply through the low murmur of the idling engines. He looked down at the faded wrap in the civilian's hands. He asked the old man how long he had kept the object out of sight. The mayor replied that he had concealed it for exactly 4 long years. Patton asked if the occupying forces had ever entered his home to search for contraband. The old man nodded, stating they had ransacked his cellar on 2 separate occasions, but had failed to look behind the loose brick. The general looked up at the empty flagpole and asked if the citizen was absolutely certain. He wanted an American unit to handle the municipal standard. The old man looked back with steady eyes and answered that he had saved it specifically for the men who would break the foreign grip on his country. Patton studied the worn cloth for a quiet moment. He noted the careful preservation, the immaculate creases, and the sheer endurance required to protect a symbol in the dark when every practical reality had been stripped away. He turned toward his tallest aide, a towering officer from the armored division, and issued his directive. He ordered the officer to step forward and assist the local leader with the task immediately. He explained that some flags survive by flying in the wind, but this particular emblem had survived by remaining hidden in the dark, and both actions required a supreme measure of human courage. He gave the old man two distinct choices. He could either let the youngest soldier in the column carry the fabric up the wooden steps, or he could hold the line himself while the United States Army cleared the way to the top of the mast. The elderly mayor held his ground, choosing to face the pole as the column stood frozen. The tallest American aide stepped forward onto the rungs of a wooden ladder, his combat boots pressing firmly against the rungs as he climbed toward the roofline of the village hall. Below him, the 74-year-old mayor stood on his own feet, reaching upward with trembling arms to pass the unfolded fabric into the officer's grip. The deep indigo, clean white, and faded scarlet wool caught the morning breeze for the first time in 48 months, snapping sharply against the sky. Approximately 60 local residents emerged from the stone doorways, gathering along the cobblestone curb in complete silence as they watched the standard slide up the mast. Some of the older civilians began to applaud with weathered hands, while others wept quietly into their coats, staring at the emblem that had survived the darkness. Mayor François Leblanc snapped his shoulders back into a rigid stance, holding a civilian salute that was physically imperfect but entirely sincere. General George Patton stood directly beside the elderly official on the dusty stone pavement, raising his hand to his polished helmet, offering a formal military salute to the faded tricolor. A four-star general stood at attention in the dirt, honoring a piece of hidden cloth next to an old man who had risked everything behind a cellar brick. Mayor François Leblanc remained in his liberated commune for the rest of his days, watching the local children grow up under a sky free of hostile patrols. He never spoke much about the 48 months he spent checking the masonry in his cellar, but he kept the heavy brass candlestick on his mantelpiece until he passed away quietly in the winter of 1953 at the age of 83. His neighbors buried him with full municipal honors, and the worn standard he had saved from the dark was draped over his wooden casket. The towering American military aide, who had climbed the ladder that morning, returned to his civilian life in Ohio after the German surrender, operating a small lumber yard and raising a family. He rarely discussed his wartime service with his customers, but he kept a small photograph of a sunlit French square tucked inside his leather wallet for more than 40 years. He died in 1989, leaving the faded image to his oldest grandson, who remembered his grandfather always describing that single morning near Chartres as the moment he truly understood why they had crossed the ocean. General Patton kept a brief mention of the old Frenchman's stubborn preservation in his personal diary, noting that the simple act of hiding an emblem required a steady, cold brand of bravery that few professional soldiers could maintain under pressure. He wrote that some men show their strength by tearing things down, while others prove their worth by keeping something fragile alive in the dark until the world is ready to receive it again. Some historians argue that General Patton's decision to halt an active combat column for a civilian standard was a sentimental distraction that risked unnecessary friction with Allied diplomatic channels. They contend that frontline commanders should remain strictly focused on tactical objectives, leaving regional political matters entirely to rear area administrators. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that recognizing the quiet endurance of local populations was essential for securing long-term stability in liberated territories. What is certain is that the faded tricolor remained atop the village hall throughout the duration of the conflict, serving as a permanent record of a community that refused to break. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have ordered the column to halt for a civilian standard, or would you have pushed forward to focus entirely on the tactical objectives ahead? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more hidden historical accounts about the human being inside the uniform, make sure to subscribe.